Hey guys, tonight we begin with a painted flag hanging from a window. Red cloth against gray stone, flapping softly in the plague wind. No soldiers, no chains, no locked gates, just fabric. And yet everyone who sees it knows the rule. Stay away. Don't knock. Don't enter. Don't even breathe too close. It's 1665, and London has turned its infected homes into visible prisons using nothing more than paint and paranoia. Welcome to the birth of quiet law, where control doesn't shout orders, it whispers through symbols. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Candle History, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of deep historical exploration. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world at all hours. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's spend the next few hours exploring how medieval and early modern societies learned to control behavior through marks, flags, and the brilliant realization that you don't need guards at every door if you can make people police themselves. The plague flag system was genius in its simplicity. When disease struck a household in 17th century London, authorities didn't waste time with lengthy explanations or complex enforcement. They painted a large red cross on the door, roughly a foot high, with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," scrawled beneath. Then they nailed the door shut from the outside and posted a watchman. Sometimes, when they could afford one. But here's the thing, they didn't always need the watchman. The mark itself did most of the work. Neighbors saw that red cross and suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Food vendors wouldn't deliver. Friends stopped visiting. Even family members hesitated. The mark transformed a normal house into a social tomb without requiring constant supervision. It was the 17th century's version of a scarlet letter, except instead of shame, it carried actual death. And unlike physical barriers that require maintenance, guards, and money, a pot of red paint cost almost nothing. Just someone willing to wield the brush and the social agreement that everyone would respect what it meant. This wasn't the first time humanity had used visual markers for disease control. Medieval leper colonies required their residents to carry bells or clappers announcing their presence so others could flee. The concept was simple: make the afflicted visible and let social fear do the rest. But the plague marks of early modern Europe refined this into something more sophisticated. They weren't just warning signs, they were administrative tools. They created a visible database of infection that officials could track, that neighbors could monitor, and that history could count. In 1665, London alone, over 68,000 people died of plague. The city kept meticulous records, organized by parish, tracked through those red crosses. Each mark represented not just a sick family, but a data point in humanity's first real attempt at epidemic surveillance. Bureaucrats could walk a street and instantly assess the situation without knocking on doors or questioning residents. The mark spoke for them. It said infected in a language everyone understood, regardless of literacy, class, or language. The system worked because it exploited something fundamental about human psychology. We're pattern recognition machines. We see a symbol, we assign meaning, we adjust behavior. No lengthy explanation needed. A stop sign doesn't require a paragraph of legal text. Neither did a plague cross. Both rely on collective understanding, on social contracts written in paint and metal rather than parchment. The difference is we think of stop signs as public safety, but the plague crosses? Those were instruments of abandonment wrapped in the language of mercy. Because here's what the official narrative never quite admitted. Those marked houses weren't quarantine in the modern sense. They were death sentences made visible. Once that cross appeared, no one was leaving. Sick and healthy family members alike were sealed inside until either everyone recovered, which rarely happened, or everyone died, which usually did. Food was supposed to be delivered through windows. Medicine was supposed to arrive. Officials were supposed to check on the imprisoned. Supposed to. Reality was messier, crueler, and infinitely more human. Many watchmen, poorly paid and terrified of infection themselves, simply abandoned their posts. Food deliveries became sporadic or stopped entirely. Families inside ran out of water, fuel, basic supplies. Some tried to escape, climbing out windows or breaking through back doors. A few succeeded. Most were caught, beaten, and locked in more securely. The mark on the door told their neighbors to report any escape attempts. It turned entire streets into prisons where everyone was both captive and guard, depending on which side of the painted cross they happened to stand. The psychological impact was profound. Imagine watching that painter approach your door, hearing the brush scrape against wood, seeing that crude red cross take shape, knowing that in the eyes of your city, your street, your world, you've just become contaminated, not by your own actions, not through moral failing, but through the accident of proximity to infection. Your house, yesterday a normal part of the community, is now a plague ship anchored on dry land. And unlike ships that can eventually sail away, you're trapped in place, marked for all to see. Children of marked houses remembered that cross their entire lives. The ones who survived, anyway. They remembered neighbors throwing stones to keep 'em away from wells. They remembered friends who stopped waving. They remembered the silence that fell over the street when their door was painted. These weren't just medical interventions. They were social excommunications. The plague mark didn't just quarantine bodies, it quarantined relationships, severing the infected from community in ways that lingered long after the disease had passed. And yet, despite the cruelty, despite the abandonment, the system worked. Sort of. Plague deaths in marked houses did eventually stop spreading to unmarked ones. Not because of any medical understanding. They still thought bad air caused plague, but because isolating the infected, however brutal the method, genuinely reduced transmission. The mark on the door was accidentally good epidemiology, wrapped in deliberately bad ethics. It saved the many by sacrificing the few, and it did so through the elegant mechanism of making the sacrifice visible. This is where things get interesting for our modern understanding. The plague flag system wasn't just about disease control. It was about discovering that you can govern behavior through symbols rather than force. That realization would echo through centuries of social engineering. Why post guards at every prohibited location when you can post signs? Why enforce every rule through personal confrontation when you can create markers that people enforce on themselves? The Red Cross didn't need to explain why you shouldn't enter. It just needed to exist. And that existence changed everything. Medieval cities had long experimented with night curfews, bells that rang at sunset to signal everyone indoors. But those required constant enforcement. Night watchmen patrolling streets, shouting at stragglers, sometimes arresting violators. Expensive, labor-intensive, prone to corruption and inconsistency. But a mark on a door, that worked 24 hours a day without wages, without complaints, without needing to be fed or supervised. It was enforcement through architecture, through the built environment speaking rules that human mouths didn't need to repeat. Other cities noticed. Florence noticed. Florence developed its own system of plague marks. Venice painted entire houses. Milan used both crosses and flags. Each city added variations, but the core concept remained. Make infection visible. Let visibility do the governing. By the 1600s, you could walk through any major European city and instantly assess the epidemic situation just by reading the doors. Health officials could compile statistics, track spread patterns, allocate resources, all based on painted symbols that turned private homes into public data. Some families tried to hide infection. They'd wash off the cross in the night, repaint their doors, smother out their sick. Officials responded with harsher paints, tar-based mixtures that couldn't be easily removed. They added penalties for defacing plague marks, death usually, which tells you something about priorities. The mark itself became more important than the disease it represented. Maintaining the system of visual control mattered more than individual cases of suffering. Because the system wasn't really about medicine. It was about order. Think about what that means. A city facing catastrophic death tolls, bodies piling in streets, mass graves being dug nightly, economic collapse, social breakdown. And yet officials found time and resources to punish people from removing paint from their own doors. That's not medical necessity. That's the bureaucratic mind discovering that visible compliance might be more important than actual health. As long as the marks stay up, as long as everyone appears to follow the rules, the system maintains its authority. Remove the mark, and you're not just hiding infection, you're challenging the entire apparatus of control. The watchmen posted at marked doors were supposed to ensure no one left. But they served another purpose too. They were visible proof that someone was watching, even when they weren't. Even when they'd wandered off to drink or sleep or find some other post that paid better. The fact that a watchman might be there, could theoretically return any moment, kept most families from attempting escape. The uncertainty itself was enforcement. You don't need guards everywhere if folks think guards might be anywhere. This principle, that uncertainty amplifies authority, would become fundamental to modern social control. Jeremy Bentham's panopticon prison design, centuries later, relied on exactly this insight. Put prisoners in cells surrounding a central tower. Make it impossible to tell when they're being observed. Let that uncertainty modify behavior. The Plague Watch system was an architectural panopticon, except instead of prison cells, it was normal homes. Instead of observation towers, it was street corners where watchmen might appear. Same principle. Make people assume they're being watched, and they'll govern themselves. At night, the marked houses took on an almost supernatural quality. Candles flickering behind sealed windows, shadows moving behind painted doors, occasional sounds of coughing, crying, prayer. The rest of the street would go dark and silent, everyone huddling inside, trying not to hear the sounds from plague houses, trying not to imagine what was happening behind those crosses. The night transformed those marks from simple warnings into almost mystical barriers, as if the paint itself held power, as if crossing that threshold would summon death like a summoned demon. Superstition mixed with practical fear. People began treating the marks themselves as dangerous, as if the paint carried infection. They'd cross streets to avoid walking near them. They'd hold their breath passing by. They'd make religious signs, whisper prayers. The rational public health measure became entangled with irrational magical thinking, which paradoxically made it more effective. Fear based on misunderstanding still keeps people away just as effectively as fear based on accurate medical knowledge. Maybe more so, because irrational fear doesn't calculate risk, it just reacts. Religious authorities exploded this beautifully. Priests blessed plague marks, treating them as holy barriers against evil spirits. The cross symbol, already loaded with Christian meaning, became doubled. It was both medical warning and religious protection. This dual nature gave the marks immense power. You weren't just defying public health orders by crossing that threshold, you were defying God. The state and church, often at odds over authority, found perfect alignment in the plague flag system. Both benefited from a population that stayed home, stayed quiet, and died without causing trouble. Some marked households fought back in desperate ways. They'd hang their own flags, white ones, signalling surrender or need. They'd write messages on sheets and hang 'em from windows. Pleas for food, for medicine, for prayer, for someone to remember they existed. These counterflags created a strange visual dialogue. Official crosses saying, "Stay away." Improvised banners responding, "We're still human." Neither side usually understanding what the other truly meant. Just symbols shouting past each other across a distance measured in painted wood and dying hope. Wealthy families sometimes bribed officials to not paint their doors, or to paint smaller, less visible crosses, or to use darker red that might be missed in dim light. Money, as always, bought exemptions from the rules everyone else had to follow. Some plague marks were obviously crude and hastily applied. Others were neat, professional, almost decorative. You could tell class status by the quality of your oppression. Even in death and disease, hierarchy asserted itself. The rich died behind tasteful marks, the poor behind hasty scrawls. Same disease, different aesthetics of suffering. Children grew up in this environment, learning to read the landscape of control. They learned which doors to avoid, which streets were safe, how to navigate a city divided by invisible but absolute boundaries. This early education in reading symbolic authority would shape generations. These were kids who understood, bone deep, that marks and flags and signs weren't just information. They were commands. That understanding, that literacy in control systems never quite left them. They carried it into adulthood, into other contexts, into the creation of more subtle systems that would govern future generations. Because here's what the plague flag system really taught Europe. You don't need constant violence to maintain order. You need visible markers of authority that people learn to read and respect. You need a shared symbolic language where everyone knows what a particular sign means and what consequences follow from ignoring it. Build that language correctly, and people will enforce rules on themselves and each other with minimal need for actual enforcement. The painted cross wasn't an endpoint. It was a prototype. Fast forward to today. Think about the last time you saw caution tape. Yellow and black stripes, thin plastic ribbon. No actual barrier. A determined person could easily step over or under it, and yet we don't. Why? Because we've been trained since childhood that yellow caution tape means do not cross. We respect the symbol more than we respect the physical barrier, which means the tape isn't really keeping us out. We're keeping ourselves out because we recognize the symbol and accept its authority. That's the plague flag's descendant. Same principle, cleaner execution. Or consider the humble "no trespassing" sign. Piece of metal nailed to a post. No fence, no guards, no actual prevention of entry. Just words on metal. And yet, millions of people every day respect those boundaries because they've learned to read property law written in signage. The sign creates the boundary. Our recognition of the sign maintains it. Remove the sign, and the boundary becomes invisible, contestable, uncertain. Add the sign, and suddenly everyone knows exactly where permission ends. That's not physical control. That's psychological governance through visual markers. Digital spaces have perfected this even further. Paywalls don't physically prevent you from reading content. They're just code checking whether you're authorized. Easy to circumvent if you know how. And yet, most people don't bother because we've extended the plague flag logic into virtual space. The paywall is a mark saying, "Not for you." We've learned to respect those marks, even when enforcement is minimal and evasion is trivial. The system works because we believe it works, because we've been taught that signs matter, that marks carry authority, that crossing marked boundaries has consequences. Modern disease control still uses visual markers, just less dramatically. Quarantine signs at airports, biohazard warnings at hospitals, even the simple sick building syndrome concept, where we learn to associate certain architectural features with health risks. We're still reading environments for danger signals, still adjusting behavior based on symbols. We've just upgraded the paint to digital displays and LED lights. The plague cross was crude but honest. Modern equivalents are sophisticated but often more insidious. They shape behavior while denying their control systems at all. The night dimension of plague control is especially important. During the day, infected families could at least hear the world outside continuing. Vendors calling their wares, neighbors chatting, life persisting beyond the painted door. But at night, that connection severed completely. Night was when the dead were collected, when removal carts rumbled through streets, when the crosses on doors seemed to glow with accumulated fear. Night transformed the marks from warnings into almost animate things. They weren't just painted crosses anymore. They were watchers, guardians, judges. Cities imposed night curfews during plague years, which meant everyone healthy was supposed to be inside too. So infected families, locked behind marked doors, existed in a world where the streets outside were equally silent. This created a strange equality of confinement. Everyone was imprisoned after dark. Plague victims by disease and painted crosses, healthy people by law and fear. The city became a collection of cells, each home a separate compartment, marked and unmarked doors creating a visible taxonomy of acceptable and unacceptable presence. Night watchmen, when they actually showed up, carried lanterns. These moving lights became navigation markers for a world divided into zones of safety and contamination. You could track the watch by following the lantern glow, judging which streets were being monitored, which were abandoned. Families behind plague marks would watch those lights pass or stop, trying to determine if anyone still cared whether they lived or died. The lantern was its own kind of flag, a moving signal of state attention in a city that had largely stopped caring about anything except containing panic. Some plague houses had their own lights, candles in windows that families kept burning as long as they could afford fuel. These lights served multiple purposes. They signaled life, that someone inside still had the strength to light a candle. They provided comfort in darkness, and they created a visual record for officials counting the dead. If a plague house went dark and stayed dark, the removal carts would be sent in the morning. The absence of light became another form of communication, a flag of silence more final than any painted cross. This created a strange nocturnal landscape. Dark streets punctuated by marked houses with flickering windows. Watch lanterns bobbing along their routes. Occasional bonfires at intersections, burning herbs and tar that people believed would purify air. The city at night during plague years looked like nothing so much as a battlefield after dark. Scattered lights marking positions, long stretches of darkness between them, and over everything the sense that the real activity was happening invisibly. People dying in the dark, bodies being moved in the dark, decisions being made about who would see dawn and who wouldn't. Children who survived plague years developed unusual relationships with darkness. They'd learned that night was when the worst happened, when the dead were removed, when escape attempts would be made and punished, when desperation peaked behind locked doors. Many developed lifelong anxieties about darkness, about closed doors, about the sound of carts in streets. This wasn't irrational fear. This was reasonable response to having grown up in a world where night genuinely was more dangerous, where darkness concealed death and removal and all the ugly mechanics of disease control that polite society preferred not to acknowledge by daylight. The carts that collected the dead did most of their work between midnight and dawn. Partly for practical reasons, cooler temperatures, less traffic, but partly for psychological management. Officials understood that watching bodies being collected was demoralizing, terrifying, panic-inducing. Better to do that work when most people were asleep or locked indoors. Better to have the streets clear by morning. Let people wake to empty streets rather than reminders of the scale of death. The night curfew wasn't just about preventing disease spread. It was about controlling what people witnessed, shaping the narrative by controlling visibility. This would become a core technique of modern governance. Control what people see and when they see it, and you control the story they tell themselves about reality. The plague years taught officials that managing perception could be as important as managing actual disease. That a city that looked clean and orderly by daylight could maintain morale even if carts of corpses rolled through it every night. As long as most people didn't see those carts, as long as the dead were removed invisibly, the fiction of normality could be maintained. The painted crosses stayed visible, but the consequences of those crosses were hidden in darkness. Some families behind plague marks kept diaries. We have these, fragments of them, saved by luck and archival obsession. They describe the nights differently than the days. Day entries are often hopeful, noting small improvements, plans for recovery, prayers for deliverance. Night entries are raw, more honest about fear and despair. Night was when the fever seemed worse, when the crosses on doors felt like brands on skin,
when the silence of the street outside became oppressive. Night was when people admitted to their pages what they couldn't admit to themselves by daylight, that they were probably gonna die, that the mark on their door was a tombstone painted vertically.
These diaries often end abruptly. A final entry, sometimes mid-sentence, and then nothing. Someone stopped being able to write. Later entries by different hands, family members taken over, and then those hands stop too. The diary becomes a record of extinction, family by family, name by name, until only blank pages remain. But those blank pages tell their own story. They're plague flags made of paper, marks of absence, proof that the system of visible control worked exactly as designed. The crosses kept people in. The night hid the consequences. And history recorded it all in blank pages and painted doors. European cities learned lessons from these experiments in disease control that would influence governance for centuries. They learned that visible markers work, that symbols can govern, that night can conceal, that fear is a tool, that bureaucracy and paint achieve more than force and violence. These weren't conscious lessons taught in academies. They were practical knowledge gained through desperate experimentation during existential crisis. Knowledge that would be applied far beyond plague control. Consider how modern cities use visual markers to shape behavior. Stop signs, traffic lights, pedestrian crossings, parking zones, loading areas, bus lanes. We navigate urban space by reading symbols that tell us where we're allowed to be and when. These aren't physical barriers. They're painted lines and metal signs. We respect them because we've been trained to read them as authority. Break those rules and consequences follow, but most people never test that. We self-regulate based on visual cues. That's the plague flag's legacy, written in yellow paint and reflective tape. Zoning laws work the same way. Commercial zones, residential zones, industrial areas, historic districts. These boundaries are mostly invisible, no walls between them, but signs mark them, building codes enforce them, and people learn to read urban space accordingly. You don't build a factory in a residential zone, not because it's physically impossible, but because the invisible markers say you can't. The zone designation is a kind of plague flag, marking certain uses as contaminated, others as pure. And like plague flags, these designations often trap people, limiting where they can work, live, or build based on decisions made by distant authorities. The modern medical system has its own versions. Hospital zones marked by colored lines on floors, quarantine wards with specific signage, biohazard containers. These visual systems guide behavior without requiring constant instruction. Staff members learn to read the environment, to know which areas are restricted and which are accessible, all through symbolic language that transforms space into information. A patient in a room marked with isolation signs gets treated differently, not because anything physical prevents entry, but because the signs change behavior. The mark changes the patient's status, exactly like the plague cross did. Digital equivalents are everywhere now. Verification badges on social media, encryption padlocks on websites, privacy settings represented by tiny icons. These are plague flags for the internet age. They mark certain spaces as safe, others as dangerous, some as restricted, others as public. We've learned to read these symbols instinctively, adjusting our behavior online the same way our ancestors learned to avoid doors marked with crosses. Click here, but not that. Trust this, but not that. All based on tiny visual markers that substitute for actual knowledge about security or trustworthiness. The genius of the plague flag system was that it distributed enforcement. Officials didn't need to be everywhere because neighbors would do the watching. Informants emerged naturally because everyone understood that one person ignoring the marks endangered everyone else. The system created its own policing mechanism through shared fear and visible markers that turned every resident into a potential enforcer. That principle never went away. It just got refined. Modern equivalents are everywhere. Neighborhood watch signs create distributed surveillance. Security cameras work even when they're not functioning because people don't know which ones are real. Your phone's location services track you, but the real control comes from knowing you could be tracked, adjusting behavior based on that possibility. We've internalized the plague flag logic so deeply that we police ourselves without needing external enforcement. The mark on the door has become the phone in your pocket, constantly signaling your location, activities, and compliance with invisible rules. Social credit systems being experimented with in various countries are just sophisticated versions of the plague flag. Make behavior visible. Create markers of good and bad citizenship. Let those markers determine access to services, opportunities, and freedom. No need for constant monitoring by authorities when the population learns to compete for positive marks and avoid negative ones. The Red Cross said, "Contaminated, avoid." Modern equivalents say, "Low score, deny service." Different words, same function. Control through visible markers that populations learn to fear and respect. And here's the uncomfortable part. The plague flag system worked. It did reduce disease transmission. It did help cities survive catastrophic epidemics. The fact that it was cruel, that it abandoned the sick, that it created systems of control that would be abused for centuries, none of that changes the basic fact that marking infected houses and enforcing isolation helped limit plague deaths. So when we look at modern versions of visual control systems, we can't simply dismiss them as evil. They're effective. That's what makes them dangerous. Tyranny that works is much harder to resist than tyranny that fails. The marked houses of plague years left psychological scars on entire generations.
People who grew up seeing those crosses, walking past those doors, hearing the sounds from inside, developed a specific relationship with authority and control. They'd learned that the state could mark your home, seal you inside, and leave you to die for the supposed greater good. They'd learned that neighbors would accept this, even enforce it, because fear overrides compassion. They'd learned that visible markers carry immense power, that a symbol can change your status from citizen to contaminated overnight. These lessons didn't disappear when plague ended. They influenced how people understood government, community, individual rights versus collective safety. They created a population that expected visual markers of authority, that looked for signs telling them what was permitted and what was forbidden. They normalized the idea that the state could, in crisis, mark certain people as dangerous and remove their rights. That normalization would enable future abuses with terrifying regularity. Once people accept that authorities can mark and restrict for public safety, arguing over what counts as crisis becomes the only real political question left. The plague years taught Europe that crisis creates opportunity for social engineering, that populations accepting extreme measures temporarily will often continue accepting them permanently. Curfews instituted during plague often remained long after disease receded because authorities discovered they liked having everyone indoors at night. Surveillance systems created to track infection became general surveillance systems. Emergency powers granted during panic became normal powers wielded during peace. The crosses on doors might come down, but the lesson remained. People will accept extraordinary restrictions if you convince them it's for their safety. This pattern repeats throughout history. Wars create emergency powers that never quite disappear. Terrorist attacks justify surveillance systems that never get dismantled. Pandemics enable tracking systems that become permanent infrastructure. Each crisis ratchets control mechanisms tighter, and they never quite release back to the previous baseline. The plague flag was an early example of crisis justifying new forms of control that would never entirely go away. The marks came off the doors, but the principle of visible marking of contaminated versus safe individuals became embedded in social practice. Modern debates about privacy, surveillance, and control are still arguing about the plague flag. Should authorities be able to mark certain people as risks? Should that marking be visible to others? Should marked individuals have rights to movement and association? Should communities be able to enforce restrictions on marked people? These are the exact questions our ancestors faced watching painters apply crosses to infected doors. We're still struggling with the same tensions between individual liberty and collective safety, still trying to figure out where the line is between reasonable precaution and tyrannical control. The night dimension added another layer. Night has always been when authorities felt justified in more aggressive control. Curfews are almost always nighttime restrictions. Police powers expand after dark. What's acceptable by day becomes suspicious at night.
The plague years normalized this idea that night required different rules, stricter enforcement, more restricted movement. And we still live with that. Most cities have different rules for nighttime activities. Noise ordinances, loitering laws, bar closing times. The assumption that darkness justifies control has never quite gone away. Young people today navigate a world of digital flags and markers without realizing they're experiencing the plague cross's descendants. Verification badges, follower counts, like ratios, these are all visible markers of status that shape how others interact with you. Get flagged by a platform's algorithm, and your content becomes invisible. You're digitally isolated, just as surely as plague victims were physically isolated. The mechanisms have changed, but the principle remains. Mark certain people as contaminated, make that mark invisible. Let the crowd do the rest of the policing work. The brilliance and horror of the plague flag system was that it required minimal state capacity. A few painters, some red paint, basic record keeping. No standing army, no secret police, no sophisticated technology. Just symbols and social agreement about what those symbols meant. Modern systems are infinitely more sophisticated, but they follow the same efficient logic. Why force compliance when you can create conditions where people comply voluntarily? Why monitor everyone constantly when you can create uncertainty about who's being monitored? Why punish every violation when you can punish a few visibly and let fear do the rest? The Watchman system showed another key insight. You don't need actual enforcement everywhere if people believe enforcement might appear anywhere. The occasional watchman at a random plague door was enough to keep most families from attempting escape, because no one knew which doors would be watched and which wouldn't. That uncertainty itself was the real barrier. Modern equivalents are everywhere. Speed cameras that might or might not be functioning. Audits that might or might not happen. Surveillance that might or might not be watching. The uncertainty keeps people compliant more effectively than certain knowledge ever could. Religious authorities understood this instinctively. They couldn't monitor everyone's thoughts or private prayers, but they could create the impression that God was always watching. Confession systems worked on similar logic to plague flags. Make sin visible through confession. Create markers of absolution or continued contamination. Let social pressure handle the rest. The church was teaching the same lessons the state learned during plague years. Control through visibility. Governance through symbols. Enforcement through uncertainty and social pressure rather than constant direct intervention. The economic dimension was crucial too. Plague flags were cheap. Paint and labor cost far less than hiring enough guards to physically enforce quarantine at every infected house. The cost savings were dramatic, which meant the system could be applied broadly across cities with limited resources. This taught authorities an important lesson. Symbolic control scales much better than physical control. As populations grow, direct enforcement becomes impossibly expensive. But symbol systems, flags and marks and signs, those scale easily and cheaply. 10,000 people can read a sign as easily as 10 people can. This economic logic drives modern systems. Physical walls are expensive. Border agents are expensive. But electronic tracking, digital markers, automated monitoring systems, these scale almost infinitely with minimal marginal cost. The plague flag's economics proved that symbol-based control was not just more humane than violence, it was more cost-effective. That realization shaped how states would approach governance forever after. Why pay for expensive enforcement when cheap symbols do the same work?
The psychological damage to survivors was immense, but rarely discussed. Children who watched their own doors being painted, who were trapped inside while their parents died, who survived but carried the memory of that cross on their door, these people never quite recovered. They'd been marked, literally and figuratively. Even after the paint was scrubbed away, even after quarantine ended, they remembered. They remembered neighbors who wouldn't help. They remembered authorities who didn't care. They remembered the Red Cross that transformed their home into a prison.
Some of these survivors became advocates for better disease control, understanding viscerally why public health mattered. Others became lifelong skeptics of authority, having seen how quickly normal rights disappeared behind painted symbols. Still others internalized the lesson so deeply they became enforcers themselves, painting crosses on other doors during later outbreaks, perpetuating the system that had traumatized them. Trauma creates strange politics. The marked become markers. The isolated become isolators. The cycle continues because the lesson was learned too well. The flags themselves varied by region and time period. London used red crosses. Some Italian cities used white flags. Other regions used black cloth. The specific symbol mattered less than the social agreement about meaning. This is a crucial insight. The power wasn't in the red paint or the cloth or the specific design. The power was in collective understanding that these marks meant something, that they commanded certain behaviors, that respecting them was mandatory. Any symbol can carry authority if society agrees to grant it authority. This is why arbitrary symbols work as well as logical ones. The yellow of caution tape has no inherent meaning. We assigned it that meaning and taught it to children and reinforced it through law and repetition until it became automatic. The red of stop signs could have been blue or green. The specific color doesn't matter. What matters is consistency and social training. The plague flag system proved this principle. It didn't matter if the cross was well painted or crude, large or small. What mattered was that everyone recognized it as the mark of contagion and adjusted behavior accordingly. Modern branding operates on identical principles. Logos are just symbols, but we invest them with meaning through repetition and social reinforcement, until they become shorthand for complex ideas. The bitten apple means innovation. The golden arches mean quick food. The Nike swoosh means athletics. These associations are arbitrary, but powerful because we've collectively agreed they mean something. The plague cross was an early branding exercise, except instead of selling products, it was selling compliance with public health orders. And, like modern brands, it worked by making the invisible visible. Disease became a logo.
The night curfew's interaction with plague flags created a double layer of control. By day, the crosses warned people away. By night, curfew laws kept everyone inside regardless of whether their house was marked. This meant that at night, marked and unmarked homes existed in similar states of restriction. Everyone was imprisoned to some degree. This psychological technique, making restrictions universal so they feel less like persecution and more like shared sacrifice, would be used repeatedly throughout history. If everyone suffers, suffering becomes normalized. If everyone is restricted, restriction becomes invisible.
Military curfews work this way. Universal service requirements, rationing during wartime. The logic is always the same. By applying restrictions broadly, you make them politically harder to resist. If only plague victims were locked in houses, rebellion might follow. But if everyone had to stay inside at night, plague victims included, suddenly the system looks more like public safety than targeted persecution. The universality conceals the targeting. This technique has been refined over centuries, but the basic principle emerged during plague control experiments. The paper trail these systems generated was surprisingly modern. Cities kept registers of marked houses, dates when doors were painted, when occupants died or recovered, how long quarantine lasted. This data collection served multiple purposes. It allowed officials to track outbreak progress. It provided evidence for legal proceedings when quarantine rules were violated. It created records for later analysis. And it established bureaucratic procedures for crisis management that would become standard governmental practice. This data fetishization, the belief that if you write something down, it becomes knowable and controllable, emerged partly from plague record keeping. Officials realized that maintaining lists of marked houses gave them a sense of control, even when actual control was minimal. The records couldn't cure disease or prevent death, but they created the illusion of administrative mastery over chaos. That illusion was valuable because it kept officials focused, kept them feeling effective, kept the machinery of government functioning when everything else was collapsing. Modern data collection follows identical logic. We track everything: clicks, locations, purchases, relationships. Because the act of tracking creates the feeling of understanding and control. Whether that understanding translates to actual improvement is almost secondary. The data exists, therefore we're doing something. The plague registers were early databases.
proven that quantifying crisis somehow makes it more manageable, even when the numbers just document failure.
The legal framework around plague marks was surprisingly complex. Laws specified who could paint the marks. Officials only, usually, preventing vigilante marking of houses. Laws determined how long marks had to remain. Penalties for removing them before official clearance. Compensation for families, theoretically, though actually getting that compensation was difficult. The entire system required legal infrastructure that cities had to build on the fly during crisis. This infrastructure, once created, rarely went away. Crisis builds bureaucracy that outlives the crisis. This pattern of emergency powers becoming permanent infrastructure is one of the plague flag system's most enduring legacies. The administrative machinery created to track plague houses became general surveillance infrastructure. The legal justifications for sealing people in homes during health emergencies became precedents for future restrictions. The data systems developed to monitor outbreaks became templates for monitoring populations generally. What started as desperate improvisation during crisis became standard operating procedure for government. The social stratification visible in plague control is darkly instructive. Wealthy families could flee to country estates before outbreaks worsened. They could bribe officials for better treatment. They could afford private physicians. The crosses on their doors, when they got crossed at all, were often more polite, smaller, accompanied by assurances of discreet service. Poor families got crude crosses painted by the cheapest laborers, got locked in tiny rooms with inadequate food, got left to die with minimal intervention. Same disease, very different treatment. This class dimension of visible control systems never disappeared. Modern equivalents are everywhere. First-class passengers bypass security lines. Rich defendants get bail. Wealthy neighborhoods get better policing. VIP credentials grant access to restricted areas. We've simply refined the plague flag into 1,000 subtle markers of who matters and who doesn't. The rich don't get sealed in their homes during crisis because they can afford to leave. The poor get locked down because they lack options. Same principle, better PR. The plague flag system taught European societies a dark lesson about the usefulness of visible stratification. If you're going to treat people differently, make that difference visible. It simplifies administration. It reduces confusion about who has rights and who doesn't. It allows for quick sorting of populations into categories with different rules. This lesson would be applied over and over. Stars of David in Nazi Germany, scarlet letters in Puritan America, caste marks in various societies, credit scores in modern capitalism. Make the difference visible, and the system can operate efficiently with minimal need for case-by-case determination. The psychological impact on people doing the marking deserves attention. The painters who applied those crosses weren't monsters. They were workers following orders, usually afraid of the disease themselves, often sympathetic to the families they were condemning.
But they did the work because that was their job, because they needed the wages, because someone had to do it. This bureaucratization of cruelty, where ordinary people implement terrible policies without personal malice, emerged clearly during plague control. The system didn't require evil people. It just required people willing to follow procedures. Hannah Arendt's banality of evil concept has roots in this earlier pattern. The watchman who locked a family inside their infected home wasn't trying to murder them. He was just doing his job. The official who ordered another door painted wasn't being sadistic. He was following public health guidelines. The neighbor who reported a quarantine violation wasn't betraying friends. He was being a responsible citizen. Each individual action was defensible. The sum total was catastrophic abandonment of human beings to die alone and afraid. That's how systems of control work. They distribute responsibility so thinly that no one feels personally guilty. Modern whistleblowers and resistors understand this intuitively. Fighting a system means refusing to be the person who paints the cross, who locks the door, who reports the violation. It means seeing that your small individual action is part of a larger machinery of control, and choosing to throw sand in the gears even when doing so is individually costly. The plague years offered countless opportunities for such resistance. Watchmen who deliberately neglected their duties, neighbors who smuggled food to marked houses, officials who delayed painting certain doors. These small acts of rebellion didn't stop the system, but they created space for humanity within it. The historical memory of plague flags shaped how later generations understood disease in authority. When cholera struck Europe in the 1800s, authorities wanted to revive quarantine marks. But populations resisted, remembering the plague crosses, understanding where that path led. This forced public health officials to develop different approaches, less visible forms of disease control that didn't carry the same historical baggage. This is an important dynamic. Once a control system becomes historically visible, becomes part of collective memory as oppression, it becomes harder to reimpose directly. You have to dress it up, call it something else, use different symbols, but the function remains the same. Digital surveillance follows this pattern. Calling it contact tracing sounds better than population tracking. Calling it targeted advertising sounds better than behavioral modification. Same systems, different marketing. We've learned from the plague crosses that if you want to control people without resistance, don't make the control look like the historical examples people have been taught to fear. Make it look new, technological, inevitable, voluntary. Keep the function, change the presentation. The cross on the door becomes the app on your phone. Both track you, both restrict you. One just has better PR. The religious dimension of the plague cross deserves deeper exploration. Using a Christian symbol, the cross, as a marker of death and exclusion created profound theological tensions. The cross was supposed to represent salvation. Instead, it became a sign of abandonment. This inversion troubled many believers, but was explained away through convenient theology. The physical cross marked temporal suffering. The spiritual cross offered eternal hope. Two different crosses, both visible, one contradicting the other. This ability to hold contradictory meanings simultaneously, to make the same symbol mean opposite things depending on context, is a powerful technique of social control. Modern equivalents include how we talk about freedom. We're told we're free while being subject to countless restrictions. The contradiction is managed through context shifting. You're free to make choices within the legally permitted options, following the rules, respecting the markers. You're free to move within designated areas at designated times unless you're marked as restricted. The freedom is real, but so are the restrictions, and we're trained not to notice the contradiction. The plague cross taught this lesson early. The religious symbol of redemption also functioned as secular marker of death. Both were true. Neither canceled the other. People learned to live with cognitive dissonance. The aesthetic dimension matters too. Some plague marks were crudely painted crosses. Others were elaborate productions, carved rather than painted, with decorative elements. This aesthetic variation reflected class, wealth, and the lingering idea that, even in crisis, appearances matter. The wealthy couldn't avoid being marked, but they could ensure their mark looked dignified. This taught an important lesson. If you can't avoid control systems, at least you can try to make your compliance look elegant. The modern equivalent is obvious. We can't avoid digital tracking, but we can pay for premium privacy features. We can't avoid security checkpoints, but we can buy TSA PreCheck. You're still being controlled, just more comfortably. The transition from plague flags to modern control systems wasn't clean or direct. It involved centuries of experimentation, refinement, and occasional rebellion. But the core insight that visible markers can govern behavior without constant enforcement, that's the through line. Medieval societies were violent, chaotic, difficult to govern. The plague flags showed that symbols could create order more efficiently than swords. That realization changed everything about how power operated in Europe and eventually globally. The global spread of European governance models meant these techniques were exported everywhere. Colonial administrators brought the logic of visible control to their territories. Mark the colonized as different through skin color, through residential segregation, through passes and permits. Make those differences visible. Let the marks do the governing work. The plague flag's descendants include apartheid passes, Jim Crow signage, Indian Act status cards, caste identification systems. All of them use invisible markers to sort populations into categories with different rights and access into space, resources, and freedom. The persistence of these systems into modernity shows how difficult it is to move past control through visible marking once societies have discovered how effective it is. We've internalized the logic so deeply that challenging it feels almost impossible.
How do you run a complex society without symbols and signs and markers that tell people where they can and cannot go, what they can and cannot do? The answer might be that you can't, at least not with current political imaginations. The plague flag broke something fundamental in human social organization. It showed that governing through fear and symbols worked. And once that Pandora's box opened, closing it again became nearly impossible. The emotional experience of living in a city of marked doors has largely been forgotten. Historical accounts focus on death tolls and quarantine policies. They rarely capture the daily psychological reality of walking streets where every third door might carry a cross, where everyone was simultaneously victim and potential threat, where normal social bonds dissolved into suspicion and fear. That lived experience, that texture of everyday life under a regime of visible control, is mostly lost, but it shaped people profoundly. It created generations who understood viscerally what it felt like to live in a society where symbols carried life or death meaning. We can't quite access that experience anymore. Our plague equivalents are different, more mediated, less immediately visible. But the structure remains. We still live in worlds of markers and zones and permitted versus restricted spaces. We've just normalized it so thoroughly that we rarely notice unless something goes wrong, unless we're suddenly on the wrong side of a marked boundary, unless we're the ones being excluded by a symbol we previously ignored or respected. The plague flags taught our societies how to govern through symbology. We never unlearned that lesson. We just got better at hiding it. The choice dimension mentioned in the video title is crucial. The plague flags removed choice from infected families. They couldn't choose to leave, to seek treatment elsewhere, to make their own risk assessments. The mark on the door canceled their agency. But it created an illusion of choice for everyone else. You could choose to avoid marked houses. You could choose to respect the symbols. You could choose to comply. Except those choices were heavily managed through fear and social pressure. The appearance of choice masked the reality of coercion. This pattern, giving people the feeling of choosing while constraining their options to pre-approved alternatives, is central to modern governance. You can choose which product to buy from the approved options. You can choose where to live if you can afford the unmarked zones. You can choose your beliefs as long as you don't act on the restricted ones. You can choose your career from the available pathways. The choice is real but bounded, shaped by markers and rules and systems that determine what's possible before you ever begin choosing. The plague flag was early training in this kind of constrained choice. You could choose how to respond to the marked door, but the mark itself removed certain choices from consideration. That pattern never went away. It just got sophisticated enough that we now mistake managed options for genuine freedom. The night changes everything, because darkness removes nuance. By day, you might see a plague house and feel compassion, might notice the humanity behind the cross, might struggle with moral complexity. At night, the marked house is just a danger zone to avoid. Details disappear. Symbols become absolute. This is why authoritarian systems prefer operating in metaphorical darkness, limiting information, controlling narrative, keeping populations uncertain and afraid. In darkness, literal or figurative, people default to simple rules. Avoid the marked doors. Trust the symbols. Don't ask questions. The complexity that might generate resistance gets lost when vision is limited. Modern information control follows this pattern. Keep people uncertain, overwhelmed with data but short on context. Make simple symbols, fact-check labels, verification badges more trustworthy than complex investigation. Let people develop night vision for navigating the world, navigating by simple markers rather than nuanced understanding. It's efficient for the system if people learn to read symbols and react accordingly without developing deeper comprehension. The plague flags worked perfectly at night because no one could see past them to the human reality behind. Modern equivalents work the same way. The symbol becomes the reality, and the actual complexity gets lost in darkness. We're now about 20,000 words into exploring how painted crosses and cloth flags taught European civilization that control through symbols is more efficient than control through force. How night enhances that control by removing nuance and complexity. How crisis enables the building of systems that never quite disappear when the crisis ends, and how all of this shapes our current reality in ways we rarely acknowledge. If you're still with me at this point, you're exactly the kind of person who understands that these historical patterns matter, that the past isn't safely contained in textbooks, but rather lives in every symbol and system we navigate today. Take a moment, if you haven't already, to subscribe to Candle History. Not because I need the numbers, but because this kind of long-form historical analysis, this willingness to spend hours exploring one topic until we understand it properly, treating you like an intelligent adult capable of following complex arguments, that's increasingly rare. If you value this approach to history, the subscribe button helps ensure we can keep doing it. The ending of the plague flag system, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. Cities didn't suddenly decide that marking houses was wrong. They just gradually stopped doing it as plague outbreaks became less frequent. The practice faded not because of moral awakening, but because it was no longer necessary. This is how most oppressive systems end. Not with dramatic rebellion, but with quiet obsolescence. And that gradual disappearance means the lessons learned never get fully examined, never get consciously rejected. They just sink into institutional memory, ready to be revived whenever the next crisis provides justification. We're watching this happen now with pandemic-era tracking systems. Some will be dismantled. Some will persist. Many will fade into background infrastructure that future generations won't even notice. And those future generations won't fully understand that these systems, these normalized facts of life, originated as emergency measures that were supposed to be temporary. They'll just know that apps track your location,
that QR codes grant access, that certain marks or certifications determine where you can work or travel or gather. They won't connect those facts to plague crosses on doors in 17th century London. But the connection exists. The lineage is direct. We're still living in the world the plague flags built. We've just repainted the crosses in friendlier colors and called them something else. The philosophical question at the heart of all this is whether societies can scale beyond certain sizes without resorting to symbolic systems of control. Can you govern millions of people through consensus and voluntary cooperation alone? Or do complex societies inevitably require markers and zones and permission systems? The plague years suggested the latter. They showed that when crisis hits, populations default to accept invisible control systems because the alternative feels like chaos. And once those systems exist, once people have learned to read and respect them, removing them becomes extraordinarily difficult, even when the original crisis has passed. This creates a ratchet effect. Each crisis enables new control systems. Some of those systems get removed when crisis ends, but never quite all of them. The baseline of acceptable control slowly rises. What would have been intolerable to one generation becomes normal to the next because they grew up with it, never experienced the previous baseline. The plague generations who grew up with marked houses thought that was normal crisis response. Their grandchildren thought it was historical curiosity. Their great-great-grandchildren don't think about it at all until they suddenly notice that their own crisis is generating marked zones and tracked populations, and they wonder where this pattern came from. It came from painted crosses on doors. It came from the brilliant, terrible discovery that you can govern through fear and symbols rather than constant force. It came from night curfews that taught people to stay inside without needing individual guards. It came from crisis creating opportunities for social engineering that would never have been accepted under normal circumstances. It came from administrative systems that found visible marking more efficient than case-by-case evaluation. It came from the very human tendency to create in-groups and out-groups, safe zones and dangerous zones, marked and unmarked populations. The red cross on the door was never just about plague. It was about discovering that visibility itself is a form of control. Make something visible, make it markable, make it trackable, and you've already done most of the governing work. The rest is just administration. This insight has driven the development of control systems for 4 centuries, and we still haven't fully reckoned with its implications. We still haven't decided if we want to live in societies organized around visible marking of difference and risk, or if we want to try something else. The conversation hasn't even really started because we don't realize we're still having the same argument our ancestors had when they looked at doors painted red and had to decide if safety justified abandonment. Walking through a 17th century plague city at night must have been like walking through a battlefield where the enemy was invisible but the casualties were marked. Every red cross was a position lost, a surrender to disease that everyone else had to avoid. The streets between marked houses were no man's lands, liminal spaces where the healthy tried to forget that sickness was literally next door. The watch patrols were reconnaissance units trying to assess damage and prevent desertion. And over everything, the darkness, removing color and nuance, leaving only symbols and shadows and fear. That's the world the plague flags built. A world where symbols matter more than substance, where marks determine status, where visibility becomes vulnerability or protection, depending on which side of the boundary you occupy. We never left that world. We just learned to see it as normal. The crosses became signs. The marked houses became tracked locations. The night curfews became closing times and restricted access. But the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Societies govern through visible marking of acceptable versus unacceptable, safe versus dangerous, permitted versus prohibited. And night, literal or metaphorical, is when that governing works best. Because darkness simplifies everything into stark binaries of in and out, marked and unmarked, safe and condemned. The choices we make about these systems, about whether to accept them, resist them, reform them, or replace them, those choices shape what kind of societies we inhabit. The people who lived through plague years made their choices. They mostly chose survival through compliance, chose to respect the marks, even when doing so meant abandoning neighbors to die alone. You can't judge them too harshly for that. The alternative was risking their own families. But you can understand that the choices made during crisis echo forward, creating precedents and patterns that constrain choices available to future generations. Their choice to accept visible control systems for public health became our inheritance of normalized surveillance and tracking. So, what do we choose? Do we keep accepting that certain people and places and activities need to be marked, tracked, monitored for everyone's safety? Or do we push back against the slow accumulation of control systems that each individually seem reasonable but collectively create something oppressive? Do we demand that emergency powers actually end when emergencies do? Do we insist that the marks on our digital doors, the tracking on our devices, the surveillance in our cities, that all of this requires constant justification rather than automatic acceptance? The plague flag taught us that visible marking works. The question now is whether we want to live in a world organized around that principle, or if we're capable of imagining something else. That's the choice the marked doors still present us, centuries after the red crosses faded. Will we keep painting crosses, physical or digital, on the doors of those we've decided are dangers? Or will we try to build societies that don't require marking people as in or out, safe or contaminated, compliant or suspicious?
The night changes everything about how we answer that question, because in darkness, it's always easier to accept simple symbols and clear boundaries than to navigate complexity with compassion. London's plague doors are long gone, the red crosses painted over, the houses rebuilt or destroyed. But the principle survived. It thrives in every sign and symbol that tells you where you can't go, what you can't do, who you can't be. It lives in the boundaries we've learned to see and respect without questioning. It exists in the subtle and not so subtle ways we mark some people as acceptable and others as risks. The doors themselves were temporary. The lesson was permanent. And that might be the darkest part of this entire story. That the real plague wasn't the disease that killed hundreds of thousands. It was the idea that safety requires visible marking of the unsafe. That idea infected civilization more thoroughly than any biological pathogen. And unlike the biological plague, which eventually burned itself out, this conceptual plague just keeps spreading, mutating, adapting to new technologies and contexts while keeping its essential nature intact.
We're all living in the city of marked doors now. Some of us on the inside looking out, some on the outside looking in. Most of us unaware that the boundaries we're navigating were drawn centuries ago by people who thought they were just trying to survive a crisis. They were. But in surviving, they built systems that would constrain freedom for generations to come. That's what crisis does. It forces impossible choices that become permanent precedents. The people who painted those first crosses probably didn't realize they were establishing a pattern that would echo through centuries. They were just following orders, doing their jobs, trying to keep everyone safe. But intentions don't determine outcomes. The road to our current surveillance state was paved with red crosses on doors and good intentions about public health.
And here we are, still reading symbols, still respecting marks, still adjusting our behavior based on flags and signs and indicators that someone else placed to guide or restrict or control us. Still navigating the night by simplified markers because seeing the full complexity would be too overwhelming. Still accepting that some people need to be marked for everyone else's safety. Still building systems that work by making certain individuals and spaces and behaviors visible so they can be managed. Still living in the world the plague flags built. Still painting crosses on doors. We've just gotten better at pretending we're not.
The night is still when it happens, when the marks matter most, when the watching feels most intense, when the boundaries seem most absolute, when the crosses, whatever form they take now, glow brightest in our imaginations and our fears. The darkness hasn't changed. Neither has the fundamental human tendency to create in-groups and out-groups, safe spaces and dangerous ones, marked people and unmarked people. We've just gotten sophisticated enough to pretend we've moved past all that. But every time a crisis hits, every time fear rises, every time we need to make quick decisions about who's safe and who's not, we reach for the same tools our ancestors did. We mark the doors. We track the sick. We restrict the marked. We watch at night. We let symbols do the governing. We accept temporary emergency measures that become permanent infrastructure. We paint crosses, red or digital, on doors and devices and people. Because it works. That's the tragedy. The plague flag system worked then, and its descendants work now. And effectiveness trumps ethics almost every time. So, thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring how a simple red cross on a door became the prototype for centuries of social control through visible marking. If this exploration made you think about the symbols and systems you navigate daily, if it made you question whether the marks you respect are justified or just inherited, if it made you wonder whether the night truly changes things or just reveals what was always there, then this time was well spent. What surprised you most? What parallels do you see in your own life? What marks are you reading right now without realizing it? Let me know in the comments. These conversations matter because the plague flags are still flying. We've just learned not to see